Welcome to the Copeland Coaching Podcast, where it's all about turning your job search into a slam dunk. Your host is Angela Copeland.
Welcome to the Copeland Coaching Podcast. I'm your host, Angela Copeland. On the phone with me today, I have Dan Schawbel in New York. Dan is the author of Back to Human, How Great Leaders Create Connection in the Age of Isolation, and he's the research director at Future Workplace. He is also the host of the 5 Questions with Dan Schawbel podcast. Dan, thank you for joining me today.
So happy to be here with you, Angela.
Well, I am just so excited to talk. You've had multiple books and they've all been super successful. This book talks about creating connection in the age of isolation. And I mean, I really relate to this idea a lot. But in reality, we're actually very connected, whether it's through social media or cell phones. It almost feels like we can't get away from each other. So I'm curious, how did we end up feeling so isolated given how actually plugged in we are to each other?
Technology has created the illusion of connection when in reality, our use and misuse of that technology has made us feel more isolated, lonely, disconnected, and really less overall, commitment to the team and organization. If we don't see and hear someone from a long period of time, the connection is weaker, and we want strong bonds, not weak ties, yet we get these weak ties when we're always looking at a screen and not looking at a individual person. So I think we get so wrapped up in the technology because these devices are built with addiction in mind. Companies like Google and Facebook and Apple, they profit from our attention. And so we need to take some of that attention back and reinvest it in our team, in our friends, our family, because those relationships are going to be the most impactful and, really make us happy compared to, just texting and emailing all the time, and we need a break too. We can't just always be working, and technology has made us always on. And with the addiction, we always feel guilty and we feel like we have to send emails on vacation or after office hours. So work has creeped into our personal lives. And as a result, it's led to, the World Health Organization says that burnout is now a crisis. It's an occupational hazard. So I think it's only the beginning because people are using these devices more and more. Teenagers are on their phone over 4 hours a day.
Oh my gosh, 4 hours a day. That's incredible. I mean, it's interesting that you mentioned the pressure of working all the time. Because I think, as the workplace has gotten more and more competitive, that's true. I mean, we feel the need to be emailing at night and on the weekend. I mean, I came from an internet background and there was always someone who had that was on call 24/7 just in case the website went down. And it's just really never ending.
Never ending. And it's actually counterproductive because if you're always working, you might not be doing a great job at what you're supposed to be doing, right? Because you're just constantly doing things. That doesn't mean you're doing the right things at the right time that are going to add the most amount of value to your team, and your organization. And if you're burned out, you're more likely to leave. So we did a study with Kronos back in 2017 and found that the biggest cause for employee turnover was that people were working longer hours without additional pay. So they're getting burned out, and that is attributed to about up to half of all turnover within an organization. And if you're a company, it's very costly. And if you're an individual, having to find another job is very stressful. So that adds to the burnout, is that, you're already burned out and now you need to look and find another job. It can be very brutal.
Right. You're right. Absolutely. I mean, that's just a terrible cycle. Well, I'm curious, through your work, how widespread have you found this to be, this feeling of isolation in the workforce? Is it, a few people are feeling this way? Is it everyone? How widespread is it?
Well, loneliness in general is an epidemic. I interviewed the former U.S. Surgeon General, and he said that loneliness has the same health reduction and reduction of lifespan as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. So it's a hazard. And there was a Cigna study of 20,000 U.S. adults that found that half are lonely and 40% lack meaningful relationships. So it's an epidemic. It's a pretty big issue. If you look at what's happening in American society, more people living at home than ever before, right? And more people, not having cars and getting driver's licenses. So people are doing as much as they can from home, which means they're isolated and lonely. We found in the study with Virgin Pulse of over 2,000 managers and employees in 10 countries that, a third of the workforce works remote often, yet 2/3 are disengaged. And we were looking at how isolation and loneliness and working from home impacts team commitment, like basically how loyal you are to that team and organization. And we found only 5% of people who work remote say that they want a long-term career with their company, that they would work with their company for potentially their whole lives, compared to 28% of those who never work remote.
Wow, that's really interesting. What do you think? So, for example, I've seen situations where like a handful of people work remote and they're sort of treated differently than maybe the people who work in the corporate office, versus I've seen companies where the whole company is remote and they have to go to a lot of trouble to make sure that they're connecting differently. I mean, is the main reason that remote workers are less committed, is it just that they don't have that connection? I mean, what do you think is driving that?
It's not just the tech addiction, but when you're not getting the FaceTime, when you're not hearing someone's voice, and if you're not in person with them, the relationship's just different. Like, I just know this personally from earlier in my career. I built a huge brand online. Most of my connections were digital. I used the blog to interview people. I, would really just comment and connect with all sorts of people in the blogging space. But my connections were pretty weak because I'd never met them in person. What the internet allowed me to do was to find these people, was to, put a name to a face, was to start the conversations. As an introvert, it was easier for me to connect online first. It wasn't until my mid to late 20s where I was like, okay, I have weak relationships. This feels strange. I feel very isolated and lonely. I need to do something about it. So, the core of message in the book and what I did was I used technology as a bridge to human relationships. I didn't let it be a barrier between me and the people I wanted to really connect with on a human level. And so I started, connecting with people, meeting them for coffee and dinners. And, I did a dinner club. I did all sorts of things to meet people. And that had a huge impact on my health and well-being. And I felt more connected, not just to them, but to the world because of it. And so I think that if we just stay on technology, it can really hurt us. But if we use it the right way, we all have to use technology in some way, in shape or form, at work, or at home. And so if we are more aware of how we're using it, and we're smarter about how, when, and where we're using it, it'll help us instead of actually hurt the relationships that we need.
Yeah, I think you're totally right. And I do agree with you. I think when you go to the trouble to, have dinner parties, meet with friends for lunch and coffee, I mean, I think it really changes your life, not just your personal life, but your work life. I mean, it can really transform things. Well, in your book, Back to Human, you kind of break it down into pieces. You talk about self-connection, you talk about team connection, and then you talk about organizational connection. And I'm curious, like, do you weight one of these as being more important than the other, or do you feel like they're all needed in order for us to find sort of happiness and fulfillment at work?
We need all three of them, especially if you want to be a leader in today's world. And I do make the case in the book that we need to focus on ourselves before we're able to be the best leader or best employee to everyone else, right? So if you want to help someone else solve their problems, solve your own problems first so that they have your undivided attention and that you can be a powerful influence and role model for them. And set the agenda first. Say, this is my vision, this is my mission, this is what we're trying to accomplish. And once you do that, it's easier to get other people on board because you're communicating to them. You're telling them firsthand, here are the expectations. This is what we're looking to do as a team. Make them feel like they belong. Make them feel like they're part of the team. And then what you need to do as a leader especially is to have one-on-one conversations to figure out what everyone else is all about. Like, for instance, I interviewed this guy, Sajard, who was a former leader, VP of Employee Experience at Johnson & Johnson. Now he works for Apple. But back then, he told me the story about how he, at 31 years old, was managing people who were 10 years his senior. And when he was doing this, there was a lot of ageism. And he kind of fell into that ageism because how he would normally connect with people his age was through LinkedIn and texting and email and basically everything related to technology. And that was not effective with his older workers. That was not their preference. So one day he had a moment. He's like, okay, I'm just going to meet with them in person. So he met with one in person, and they actually had a really meaningful conversation about, family and friends and interests and what the individual wants to get out of their job and what their aspirations are. And because of that conversation, the relationship changed in a very positive way. The older worker had more respect for him and was more engaged. And he felt like, he was doing the job of a leader, and he was able to better serve that employee's needs. And without those type of conversations, without, really getting to know someone, you don't know what they're thinking. You don't know what they want from work. You're not going to be able to really help them in the way you need to as a leader. And therefore you'll be ineffective and they might not stay very long.
That makes a lot of sense. It's funny. I really relate to your story about managing people who are older than you. The first few times that I managed people, most of the people I was managing were old enough to be my parents. And that was tricky, to sort of figure out that relationship. I mean, I think it can be very intimidating too when the people you're managing seem older and more experienced than you when you're really young. But anyway, that's really interesting. Well, also when you mentioned like the self connection, team connection, and then organizational connection, you mentioned kind of getting yourself straight first. I mean, do you think of these almost like Maslow's hierarchy, where it's like you've got to start with self before you can move to team, before you can move to organizational, or do you not necessarily think of it in a certain order?
You need to focus on human needs first before work needs. If you solve someone's human needs, you're also solving their work needs. So human needs come first, because think about this. If you're lonely in the workplace, you're not thinking about how to be the best worker possible. You're not thinking about new creative and innovative ideas. Your brain is saying, hey, get some friends, right? And so that's why Maslow's hierarchy of needs is so important, because if you don't have love and friendships, you'll never be self-actualized. And this really holds true for another young leader I interviewed for the book named Rashida. It's a leader at IBM, another vice president, rock star in her early 30s. And her manager, Allie, recognized something early on in their relationship. Rashida was living in North Carolina. She got relocated to New York, which is much more expensive in the city. And she was there for her. He took her in like she was his daughter, provided for her, helped build her network in New York City, which can be very hard unless you know people. And, as a result, they became good friends. She felt like her needs were accounted for, safety, love, shelter, food. And so she was able to be a very highly productive worker as a result. And that relationship continues. She was invited to his kid's wedding. Like, so many great things have come from that relationship, from being a leader that catered to someone's human needs.
Wow, I really like that. And I think the thing that's so nice about it is, in our careers, we switch jobs many times, very often. And if you've created those kinds of relationships, you have people that you can recruit to come with you, or that may recruit you to go somewhere else. And you can sort of build on that experience over time. I think that's really interesting. Well, I'm curious, as we're talking about sort of connection and we're talking about loneliness, it kind of makes me think, I think of companies like Google, and they have all sorts of things. I think they have like laundry, they have probably free food. I mean, they have a lot of things that maybe we didn't have in the past in a workplace. And as we think about loneliness and connection, do you feel like we as employees, are we expecting more of our workplace today? Or do you think it sounds like in a way that maybe the connections changed? I mean, which do you think it is?
No, I think what's happened is that we're relying more and more on technology because from a corporate perspective, they're trying to scale and lower costs. And the best way they do that now is to have maybe fewer workers or to have more technology in place of the human connection. And at the same time, more workers want flexibility. They want to work from home. So we're kind of doing it to ourselves if you think about it. And so a lot of people are willing to trade this short-term benefit of flexibility for what they actually want, which is long-term happiness through relationships. Like I'll give you an example. Another leader I interviewed, Mike Schnellner, he was a leader at Biogen, and early in his career as a recruiter, he was able to work from home, and then he was able to work from home more regularly. And he recognized that he was missing out on the human touch. And so he started to work at the office more and more because he realized that, if you're working from home every single day, it really cuts you off from the human connection that spurs creativity and engagement and collaboration that can lead to better outcomes. And I think working from home sounds great. I've worked from home for over 8 years. But if I don't create a schedule where I'm getting out and having lunch and getting coffee and meeting the team and really putting myself out there, then it would just drive me crazy. It's like I say now, it's like we need each other to survive. It's because think of what happens if you have no social interaction, even for a few days. And then you go to an event, you feel weird. Because if you're not constantly, exercising your social muscle, it weakens and you have to almost rebuild it every time.
That totally makes sense. And I love the point that you made about that companies use technology to save money because it's scalable. Like God, it makes so much sense. And I know what you mean about sort of working remotely. I'm self-employed too, and I actually have an office in an office building for this exact reason. And it's like an entire floor that's dedicated to sort of like solopreneurs, and each person has their own office that they can go to every day. And it's interesting because I'll talk to the person in the office next to me, and he sells like a hair loss sort of solution, which is totally different. But we have really good conversations about work and even just talking about personal stuff, like having someone there to bounce ideas off, or just to talk about like, how's your family? How's everything going? I mean, having someone to talk to, I think is really important, and it's pretty incredible, like the difference that it makes.
Yeah, and what's really interesting is we have done a ton of research on, generational differences, and the thing that's always comes up, regardless of age and generational class, is that everyone wants human interaction. They want to work in a physical space. They want in-person meetings. They all want that. It doesn't matter how old you are, if you're male or female, none of that matters, or even geography. But what people want is different than how they actually behave, meaning that they want the human interaction. They want to work at a corporate office place. But if you actually see them in action, they're looking down at a smartphone.
It's true. That's true. That's very interesting. I mean, and you're right. People want that human interaction, but my guess is it goes back to the addiction and also the pressure to constantly be up to date, constantly be checking your email.
And that pressure is driven from leadership or the work culture, but we're also guilty of it.
Right.
We personally need to learn how to turn off. And I've seen this in many different situations. Like some people at the dining room table, if they're with their family, they put their phones in the middle of the table. I see this in the workplace with meetings. The phones go in the middle of the table, or they're turned off, or they're put on the side. Basically, people creating rules. Someone having a work phone and a personal phone, and then after work hours, they turn off their work phone. So I think it's harder if you're an entrepreneur because customers always want to be able to talk to you, so you have to be harder on yourself. I think a lot of people, what they do is they put rules together where they only read email once in the morning and once at night.
Mm-hmm.
So you got to create your own rules. You have to self-manage, and this leads me to mention that our calendars are so important. The way people look at our calendars is if it's not on our calendar, it doesn't exist, and that we live and die by our calendar. And if that's true, then our calendar needs to include personal activities, not just work ones. Meaning that, if you want to call, like for me, I call my parents every day, that needs to be on my calendar. If I want to go for a run every day, that needs to be on my calendar. If I want to meet a friend 4 times a week, to co-work together, I do some of that with some of the local writers in New York, then I book that. And so we have to self-manage too. We can't expect it to be managed for us.
Oh, I totally agree. I think setting aside personal time, like it's setting priorities. It's saying these are the things that are important to me and I'm going to make time for them. They're not going to come last or, they're not going to get overlooked. I think that's really, really smart. Well, in terms of companies saving money, one of the other things many companies have switched to, especially in bigger cities, are open offices. And I'm curious, a lot of times when you ask a company, like, why are you using an open office? They'll talk about connection. Like they want to create, a more collaborative work environment. And I'm curious, based on your research, do you feel like open offices are helping or do you think they're maybe hurting?
Okay, so this is a really great topic because there was a study out many years ago that said open offices were good for productivity and collaboration and human interaction. And then there was Harvard researchers that came out several months ago that said that's actually not true. With open offices, people speak to each other less, which I thought was really fascinating. So what we did was we partnered, because I do a ton of research, and by September, it'll be over 50 research studies surveying over 1.3 million people in 25 countries. And one of the studies we did recently is very relevant to this. And on May 13th, we worked with Polycom, which is now Poly, and we surveyed thousands of employees in several countries, and we found very interesting things like the impact of noise in the workplace. And it turns out that younger generations want the open office more than older generations, which is exactly the opposite of what you think, and that they're okay with the noise. Whereas older generations don't want the noise at all and would rather not have an open office because of that. And if you look at what's happening with, the world, you have like over 80% of all offices worldwide are open offices. Walmart just announced the, design and the creation of their new headquarters. It's an open office. So I don't think we're going to change that anytime soon. And that's why you're seeing so many people in open offices wear headphones, sometimes even noise canceling headphones, in order to feel like they have time to focus on their work and not constantly getting distracted. Because when you have low to no partitions, instead of at least cubicles or offices, there's gonna be a lot of noise, and that could be a big problem. And if you're always distracted, you're just not as focused. You're not going to get everything done. And in today's world, there are so many distractions, as you know.
Yeah.
The amount of content, like I have unsubscribed from God knows how many newsletters. It's just an overload. And so we have to be smarter about what sources we trust. We should have some diverse sources to get different insights and perspectives, but we can only handle so much. So everyone is trying to, be smart about the 24 hours they get in a single day. And we found that almost 100% of employees report that they get distracted while working in their personal workspace. So we're all distracted.
Right.
Some of us, it's worse for some of us than others.
Well,
But I will admit, even younger generations who think that, the noise is okay, it is affecting them, whether they're conscious of it or not.
Well, that was actually going to be my question, is even though they're okay with it, is it still impacting their productivity? It sounds like it probably is.
They say that they're better at dealing with distractions than older generations too.
Well, I'm not sure I believe that.
Over a third of Gen Zs use headphones to deal with distraction, while only 16% of baby boomers do the same. Yet, everyone can buy headphones, right?
Sure. But at the same time, like headphones are just the noise distraction. I think there's still like the visual distraction that's kind of going on around you. But
the biggest distraction is other people. That's what we
right.
found for everyone. And it makes sense. But the thing is, people don't have to be the distraction. There's been other research on this too. We need a delicate balance of time alone and time spent with others, time to
Right.
collaborate and time to actually focus on the job at hand.
That's really interesting. Well, so I'm curious, like with the age difference that you saw, do you think that people who are young today that are that are okay with the open office, like, do you think their preferences may evolve as they get older, or do you expect to see this being a constant going forward?
I think this is going to be constant. I think everything evolves, right? But there's always consistencies. There's always going to be new technologies there. The office is constantly shifting. People have their own preferences. People's habits change based on the technology. Like, I think the big disruptor now is voice.
Mhm.
I think soon we're going to be managing a lot of our tasks by saying something into Alexa or some other voice device. And I think from obviously our consumer perspective, ordering from a device and just speaking it instead of actually doing it, I think that's going to become more of the norm. I mean, look at podcasting. There's over 700,000 podcasts. Podcasts are going to be $1 billion industry in the next several years. So it's massive. And that's a proof point that audio is where it's at. And audio, the fact that we want audio much more now, just like we wanted radio many years ago, right? It's still there, audio, visual, is that changes everything. It changes everything because it's less about what you can type and more about, where you are, what you have to say,
Mhm.
and what you need, and how digitally savvy you are, right? And so that's where it becomes interesting because you have to understand, you have to play nice with the technology. You have to know how to use it. Otherwise, you're going to be irrelevant and that's going to affect your career prospects. But if you're always using it, that can hurt your personal life and maybe your work life, which
Mhm.
could create other sorts of complications for you. So
Mhm.
again, you're not going to have an exact balance, but it's a delicate balance. It's really like figuring out what's going to work for you, but being conscious of having the technology, what you're using it for, and then when to turn it off so you can actually get back to human.
Mhm. That makes sense. That makes sense. Well, I'm curious. So, staying on this topic for just a second, you know, I've had jobs where I had an office and it came in really handy because a large part of my job was doing negotiations. And I would often do those over the phone. Like I would have a phone call with a salesperson and kind of, get an understanding of their product and maybe talk through pricing. And I know that at some companies with open offices, they have these sort of like phone booths that are in different places in the space where you kind of go if you need to make a call. But to me, making a call or taking a call was like a continuous sort of thing in my role. So I just really have a hard time picturing like when I have walked through open offices like recently, what I noticed is that everyone is really silent because they're trying to not disturb each other. So, and I don't think I saw like landline phones sitting on any of the desks. Um, is that mainly how people are coping with it? Is that they go to sort of like this cell phone booth, or I mean, what happens?
Yeah, it brings up another point is that people want flexibility, not just in terms of where they work and when they work and how they work, but like in terms of the actual space where they work. You know, you might want to work in a lounge area today or, later today or tomorrow you want to work in the cafeteria or you want to work in a cube or an office. And so I think that flexible workspaces is where it's at because it gives people options during the day and makes things less boring because you can change your environment slightly. And I think that with all the noise in the open office, as long as the company also has other ways of working in places, that could be useful as well. It's just if it's just an open office and you have, you know, just conference rooms that are hard to book, that's going to be a tough sell, right? It's going to bother people. But
Mhm.
if you have a nice lounge area, if you have huddle rooms, which are the smaller rooms where 2 to 4 people can work, that could really help. And then if you give a little bit more flexibility, if you say, hey, you can work from home a day a week, what a lot of the professional service firms do is they have hot seats. You come in and you get to choose where you want to work, choose your cubicle, choose your office, choose whatever. And I think that freedom of choice is always going to be at the center of what the customer or what the employee wants moving forward, because they all desire personalization. But if you don't give them the freedom of choice and they're stuck in that environment, it's going to affect their productivity and they're going to become very unhappy. So as long as if you have the open office, have other options too, is what I'm saying.
That makes a lot of sense. Well, so I have one last question on this topic, and you mentioned other options. So one of the big topics right now, and I just haven't been able to get a really good answer on this, but a lot of companies are talking about neurodiversity and how they want to hire people, who come from all different backgrounds in terms of that. So what I mean is, maybe an employee comes in with a learning disability, whether it's, maybe they have some form of autism, or maybe they have ADHD or some other sort of difference, learning difference. And when we are in school, there are accommodations given. So like during an exam, the default accommodation would be a private room to yourself to take the exam. And I know for people who are kind of neurodiverse individuals, it can make a huge difference. Like the person can go from, making a D in a classroom full of people where they're distracted on a test to making an A or a B in a private room. And I've asked a number of folks who work in HR about this issue as it pertains to open offices. And there seems to be a real lack of awareness around this issue, even at big organizations. And so it makes me think that people who are neurodiverse they're keeping it a secret and they're sort of just struggling through it. But I mean, are you seeing companies that are taking this into consideration and thinking about the accommodations that they could offer someone that can't work in an open office setting?
I haven't heard of too many conversations like that, but I think we're going to start to have more and more of them, right? I think the research is clear that, not everyone is happy in an open office. And think about it like this. I mean, you have a lot of job-seeking listeners, and if you're selecting a company, that should be part of your criteria if it matters to you. When you're interviewing on site, you should look at their office, get a little tour. Because if that environment does not reflect how you best work or want to work, then maybe it's not the right company for you.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think the thing that's tricky, though, you quoted a number that something like 80% of companies are going to open offices.
Right, over 80% already have it.
Yeah, and so as a job seeker, especially if you live in a big city, it can all be really hard. And I mean, one big issue when you talk to folks who work in the neurodiversity space is the fact that most people who are neurodiverse are underemployed. And I know that when I work with job seekers who are, they're struggling, and a lot of times I think it's because they're not getting accommodations. So it's interesting because on the HR side, when I talk to folks, they've never thought about this issue. But if you talk to like a college or a school, this is the number one accommodation that they give to students who are neurodiverse. So it's, to me, there's like a gap there in like knowledge and understanding, but that's a bit of a tangent. Well, so I saw a video where you were being interviewed and you mentioned something that I had really not considered. And I was like, wow, this is really interesting. I want to ask about this. And that is conflict and how technology is changing the way that we handle conflict. And I'm curious, like, how do you think it is changing the way we handle conflict? And do you think it's good or bad?
Yeah, I think it's bad. I mean, we just did a study with Randstad, and the video you saw was the HLN TV segment, I assume.
Mm-hmm.
That's where I talked about it. We did a study with Randstad, and we found that, about half of employees are using technology to solve work conflicts over having face-to-face interactions or phone calls. And I think that's a huge problem because I think that in that circumstance, technology could be making things a lot worse. I mean, trying to solve an argument over text when people don't get a sense of what you're feeling and what you're thinking, and it's harder to convey what's going on and maybe solve the problem by just going back and forth and sending like 5-word texts. So I think that you can save yourself a lot of time by just picking up the phone or walking a foot to your coworker's office or desk and just speaking things out. And we found in another study with Virgin Pulse last year, the biggest thing that gets in the way of face-to-face communication at work is email. Yet, a study in the Harvard Business Review found that one face-to-face interaction is more successful than 34 emails back and forth. And it's because there's a lack of misunderstanding. So, as a tip, if you are constantly going back and forth through email with someone, it means that the message isn't coming across, that it's not actionable, and that there could be misunderstanding. So that's the time when you should pick up the phone.
That makes sense. I think the reason that this stuck out to me when I saw the HLN interview was that I don't think it would ever cross my mind to handle conflict through email or through text message. And I'm just curious, do you think that in itself is like a generational thing?
Yeah, I mean, we found in the Randstad study that many, many, many Gen Zs text during a business meeting. Like that's a common habit. Yet it's very rare for older generations. So I think it is. If you're Gen Z, you grew up and had a smartphone. When I was growing up, there were just landlines. So it's been huge differences. I don't know if you remember the phone from Saved by the Bell, the huge phone. It was like the first cell phone. Yeah, I remember those days. But if you're born today, you don't know those days. So I think that is what's separating age groups and generations more is this technology gap. And you can't change it. Older generations can learn the technology and get familiar with it. I'm not saying they can't. It's just there's a big difference between learning it now as a 50 or 60-year-old and learning it as you're growing up.
That makes a lot of sense. Well, I got the sense, as we were talking in the beginning, that you would tend to say that the younger generations are also the ones who are feeling more isolated. Is that true, or did I misunderstand that?
No, I think that's one of the most interesting things. You would think that senior citizens would be the most lonely, but it's actually younger people.
That makes sense. Well, if we are listening today and we are feeling isolated in our work environment, what can we do to make it better?
Reach out, put the effort in to make a new connection. If you're a leader, what we found the smartest thing you can do to create more human, engaged workforce is actually to have offsites. So it's not even to be in a physical office space, but, I think anyone who has sales conferences or, they have offsites where they do team activities and dinners and barbecues and all sorts of things, that's going to be really effective because if you're in that setting, you're more likely to talk about your personal life, not just work. If you're in the work setting, you're less likely to want to talk about your family because the context is work. And so we found that that's the top thing you can do. Also workations, like going to a different city and maybe a different country because it makes it more exciting. That's why retreats are so effective, And we're living in the experience renaissance right now. All this technology is forcing us to get out there and be more human. There's adult day camps now. There's these massive festivals. There's yoga and meditation retreats. There's so many different experience companies now, and it's because people are desperate for the human connection. And in terms of other things, is of course you can set rules. Like during a meeting, you can put your phones in the middle of the table, but at the same time, I believe everyone should treat each other like adults. So I think it's just promoting the importance of human connection and creating events, inside your company where people can come together and talk and communicate, not making it forced, but making it part of the culture that, I know there's some leaders that I interviewed for the book where if you're at home, you have to do a video conference. You can't just call in. So it forces the behavior that way. It's setting the guidelines. It's explaining why, not just doing it, but we're doing it because human connection is important. And the reality is that if you don't, have these connections with people and these real relationships, they're not going to stay with you. And that's going to be an even bigger problem.
That makes sense. I'm curious, you mentioned adult day camps or retreats and things. And I agree they're really fun, but Are there certain like, are you seeing that more on the coasts? Because I don't see that as much like in the center of the country.
Well, I'm seeing that some of these experienced companies are bringing people to the middle of the country and places that people on the coast would never normally want to go or
Oh,
think
that's
of.
really interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. That's super cool. Well, I'm curious, like, so say we're an individual and we are listening and we're like, you know what, I do need to reach out. I do need to create connection. And the only thing I have control over is myself rather than like everyone else in my company. I mean, do you recommend like many companies have a culture where you might not even take a lunch, like you're just working and focused at your desk. And when it comes to actually doing it, do you recommend that people go and they actually say to someone face to face, like, hey, I'd love to get lunch, or send them an email invitation? Like, how do you typically reach out?
Yeah, I do what I've always done in the beginning, which is you reach out through email or text, and then you put something on the calendar. The reality is everyone wants to do things on their own time, not yours these days. So because of that, it's hard not to play into it. But as long as the intent is to have a more human connection, I think technology is fine. Let technology be an enabler of that.
Okay. That makes it a little less uncomfortable, I think.
Yeah, I mean, as an introvert, the internet's been very important to me because it's hard for me to walk into an event with 400 people and get to know people better. That's just not my a successful environment for me.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And I think, I talk to job seekers a lot who feel like, I'm an introvert. They're also introverts. And they say, I feel like I'm failing at networking because I can't go into a big event. I'm like, well, there's other ways to do it. And they might even be more effective. So, like, don't beat yourself up about that. I think it's like totally fair. Well, I'm curious, like, if we're interviewing today and we're feeling isolated in our current job, like, how can we look for a place to work that's actually going to have a culture where we can find that connection that we're seeking?
Well, look to see what your friends say, the people you know. Have they had good experiences? Look on Glassdoor to see what management's like and what the culture is. You know, you'll never truly know until you experience it, though. So you just do your best when it comes to that type of decision making, because what works for your friend might not work for you. So it's about collecting as much data as possible to make a more informed decision, like it's always been. Except there's
Mhm.
more data points now, not just talking to people. You could always talk to people, but there's Glassdoor, there's online review sites. Um, you know, go on LinkedIn and message people who work for the company.
It's a good idea.
The only
You'll
the only way you're going to know is the truest way to know is by experiencing it. And it could be, so you might start a job and you might not really know for a few months. Uh, so you could get stuck in that. You just have to collect the data, make an informed choice, and then give it your best shot. And then if it doesn't work, give yourself a certain amount of time and then look for other jobs.
I think that's perfect advice. And I love using Glassdoor, first of all, for the reviews about companies. And then the other thing is, it is really interesting when you message people on LinkedIn who you don't know and you're kind of like trying to get to know the company, because I've noticed there will be people who work for one company and all the people who work there are like super open to like, getting messages from someone they don't know. But then there may be another company where most people who work there are really not very open to talking to new people. And I find it to be really interesting when you approach new people on LinkedIn to see how receptive or not that they are.
It comes down to this. Do you know them? Do you know someone who knows them? Do you know someone who knows someone who knows them? If not, a small percentage will reciprocate or respond to you. And that's all that matters anyways. You just need a few people. And like anything else, for everything I've done in my career, I just keep reaching out, reaching out, reaching out. And, everyone who says yes, that just helps me get further to where I want to go. Right. But you don't know who's going to say yes until you reach out. So instead of questioning things all the time, you should use the same time to just reach out.
You make a very, very, very good point that I think we can all take into so many areas, which is about the fact that you don't have Like every single person does not have to say yes to you. And the same thing applies to job seeking. Like a lot of job seekers go out and the minute they get one no, they assume that means everyone's going to say no. And that's not the case. You just have to keep trying because a few people will say yes if you just keep trying. Well, I want to pivot for just a second and ask you a question from your book that's on a slightly different topic. You have a chapter in your book where you talk about hiring for personality. When it comes to hiring for personality, do you think of that as the same thing as culture fit? And why should we be hiring for personality?
It has a lot to do with culture fit. Absolutely. And I think you should hire for personality and train for skill. So hire people that you want to spend a lot of time with because you're spending a third of your life at work. So if you don't like who you work with, that's going to affect the work you do. It's more important than the work you do. And I think that when you hire for personality, there's certain traits that you should look for. The first and most important is attitude. Does this person really want to work in my company? And for me, I got my first job, not just because I had a 2-page resume and all this experience, but it's because I would do whatever it took to get a job with this company. I remember my first manager would tell you that the first interview, it wasn't really even an interview. We were at the company cafeteria, but I treated it like an interview and I was so serious. It's the only company I want to work for. And that really helped me get a job offer. So attitude is king because you want to hire someone who's really excited. They're more likely to give their best work, stay longer, just be the best employee they can because they really want to be there. There's intent behind it. There's a reason why they're applying for the job. It's not just one of 1,000 jobs they're applying for. Mm-hmm. Right? Because if it's just one of 1,000 jobs, they won't have the right attitude because they're going to think of it as just a numbers game and whoever will pay me. You want someone who's like dedicated and like really cares about the company. And you can find that from not just their tone, their excitement, their body language, but how much they prepare for that job interview. And what I've found in research over years and years and years is that the biggest frustration that recruiters have are unprepared job seekers, people who haven't done the research on the company. Mm-hmm. That's the biggest frustration by far.
I've totally heard that. Well, Dan, this is excellent. You have so much good content. Where can we go to learn more about you and to find your book?
You can go to Amazon.com and buy Back to Human. All of my research and resources are on danschawbel.com, DANSCHAWBEL.com. And you can listen to my podcast at 5 Questions with Dan Schawbel on iTunes.
Excellent. Well, Dan, thank you so much for joining me. It's been great to have you today.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
And thank you for listening. If you've enjoyed the episode today, please don't forget to help me out. Go to Apple Podcasts and subscribe to the show. The more subscribers we have, the easier it is for people to find the show.
Thank you for listening to the Copeland Coaching Podcast today with your host, Angela Copeland. Tune in next time to get more great tips on turning your job search into a slam dunk.